The following program is brought to you in conjunction with the folks at Grace to All with Paul Gray. Now we bring to you the Agape Guy Show with your host, Lenny Manning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Agape Guy Show. I'm your host, Lenny Manning. To start off, I'd like to give a word of warning that the things we're going to discuss on this episode are quite controversial. It might even trigger some people, so you might want to brace yourself. If you saw the last few episodes, you know that I started a series that I called Understanding the Duns. I discussed the main reasons why the Duns are concerned about many aspects of typical conventional church groups. There's also some subjects that they've heard alternative ideas about, and they're more attracted to those alternative ideas. Now, I have a lot of hope for the Duns because I've seen that a lot of them are learning about God's love. I've seen great things happen in people's lives as they learn about God's love too. Today I'd like to talk about my experiences as I reassess the issue of God's love through the years. If you want to hear about how I first learned about God's love, you can see it in the first episode of my show, Season 1, Episode 1. You can look in the on-demand section of the Grace Awakening Network also, or on my YouTube channel. You can go on YouTube's search box and type in Agape Guy Show, and it should be the first one or two icons that you see. A few years after I learned about God's love, I noticed that a lot of people that didn't believe in it got very hostile about talking about it. They would speak out against it and even get to the point of being verbally abusive and psychologically abusive. I knew that I had a good apologetic defense for believing in God's love, yet most people didn't want to hear it. They only wanted to take the opportunity to raise their voice to tell me that I was wrong. I usually ended up with them shouting me down or something like that. They basically wanted me to just sit down and shut up. Since they wouldn't listen to my reasonably well-informed apologetic defense for God's love, I typed it out. I then put my typed-out defense on Facebook for all my friends and family to see. I noticed that no one commented on it at all. I didn't know if my apologetic defense was flawless, and they didn't want to admit it, or if they just didn't read it at all. I later broke it down into smaller chunks that were 2 or 3 short paragraphs instead of 2 or 3 pages. As I posted those smaller, devotional-sized chunks, no one commented on those for a while either. A while later, my uncle spoke to me at a family reunion dinner and told me that he loved my devotional comments about God's love. He said he loved them and found them to be very inspirational. I had never expected to see someone like that give me words of encouragement like that. I hoped other family and friends recognized it, but no one mentioned it to me. Yet my uncle was an easygoing guy, and he had recently decided to believe in God and started going to church. Yet I greatly appreciated his encouraging words considering other family and friends attacked me for my beliefs. That uncle recently passed on, and I relayed this story to his family and how he gave me an encouraging word about the devotions I put on Facebook. Now, the rest of my family and friends still refuse to acknowledge my defense of God's love. They still refuse to believe it or take my apologetic defense into consideration. Some of them might say they studied apologetics and like apologetics, yet they didn't seem to like it when I gave some evidence to prove my point about God's love. A few years ago, after learning about God's love, I wrote that article for my friends and family. I addressed the subject of God's love and the arguments against it. I even listed a lot of the arguments evangelical and fundamentalist Christians use. I even let a friend who was a seminary graduate read it, and it left him stunned and speechless. He made the following admissions to me about it. 1. he admitted he had never considered those things I wrote about. 2, he admitted he couldn't refute it. And 3, he told me I was right about God being a loving God. He had previously been arguing against it, but finally realized I had a reasonable apologetic defense for it, and I had reasonable evidence. I then posted that article on Facebook a short time later for all my family and friends to read. This article contrasted the concept of a loving God with traditional Christian beliefs. It also compared the concept of a loving God to what theology teaches and what theologians would say about it. I refrained from mentioning any controversial things that theologians would usually argue against. I showed evidence that God isn't angry with us because of every little behavioral issue we have. I also hinted that God doesn't begrudgingly let us into heaven someday, even though he's really just angry with us. So I was a bit sneaky and used their own ideology and theology against them. I used it to show the error of believing in an angry and wrathful God. I'm not saying I agree with all evangelical theology my family adheres to, but I was using it to prove a point. I was also using their own beliefs to show their faulty logic. Now, I'm going to get a little bit theological on the show today, but I rarely like to talk about theology anymore. I don't like to talk about theology because the Bible states, knowledge puffs up. The Apostle Paul mentioned that theological discussions lead to worthless arguments. You can see those things in 2 Timothy 2:14 and Titus 3:9. I prefer to stick with God's love and the fruit of the Spirit these days. I know a bit of theology, but before I learned about God's love, my theological knowledge only made me an arrogant religious snob, and I'm not too proud of that either. I looked down my nose at everybody and considered that I was better than everyone else. Yet surrendering my life to God and His love changed me from within. It changed me so drastically that my friends said it was like I wasn't even the same person anymore. So I prefer to stick with that kind of life-altering love, especially since it's the only thing that helped me change my life for the better. I've updated a few parts of my article, so you can see what you think as I go through it. Here's the article that I originally titled, Is God's Love Balanced by His Justice and Wrath Against Sin? Many Christians these days seem to think that God is an angry and wrathful God, and God's love must have balance. If someone mentions 1 John 4:8 that states God is love, they are quick to give a response that seems kind of rehearsed. They say things like, but you need to balance God's love with His justice and wrath against sin. They might even mention something about God being holy. Church leaders indoctrinate many of their followers on this matter, and it's quite obvious in my opinion. I would answer that God isn't an angry and wrathful God. I can even use typical standard evangelical theology and words from their own theologians to prove it can't be true. The first problem with the idea of an angry God is that the Bible never shows anger to be God's nature. As I attended theology classes, I was taught that love is the nature of God. The Bible never teaches that justice is God's nature either. Justice is a mere attribute that stems from God's love. If anger, wrath, and justice were part of God's nature, then no human who ever made a mistake in life could exist. God would wipe them out the instant they first made a mistake, or misbehaved, or committed a so-called sin. Even His justice comes from His loving nature. He set up justice to restrain people from hurting each other. God intends for this to slow down man's or people's desires for vengeance. So He seeks to give people the chance to live a decent life by living in peace with other humans. So by saying that God is a God of justice, they're saying that they don't believe love could be God's nature. They don't believe deep down in their hearts and minds that God is love, as stated in 1 John 4. Thus, many Christians contradict or refuse to believe the Bible they claim to believe in. They also show that they believe God hates sin so much that he hates us humans. They reason that since we have behavioral problems, God is angry with us. He is so angry that he hates us and wants to wipe us out. He then must play the part of a judge and sentence us to some form of punitive punishment. Yet if God hated us to this extent, then his character would contradict the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22 and 23. Thus, the fruit of the Spirit wouldn't be a true reflection of God's character or nature. So God would basically be a murderous maniac who wants to wipe everybody out, or wipe out as many of us as possible. Yet if God hated us to this extent, then his character would contradict the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22 and 23. Thus, the fruit of the Spirit wouldn't be a true reflection of God's character or nature. So God would basically be a murderous maniac who wanted to wipe us all out if it's possible. Yet if that was true, then where would we ever see the fruit of the Spirit? Where would we ever see love, kindness, gentleness, goodness, peace, patience, or self-control? How could we ever get a glimpse of grace, mercy, or forgiveness? I can say that there are many other places in the Bible that support the idea that love is God's nature. 1 John 4 uses the phrase, God is love. The way the word is was used means it's God's nature, it's who he is. Yet God being loving is also found in more than one chapter in the Bible. I found 25 Bible passages that show God is loving. Here's a list of 25 verses. If someone tells those folks that their theology contradicts the Bible, they change tactics. They usually use word games. They first try to make it seem like they aren't contradicting the Bible. Then they act like they're good people believing good things. Yet in reality, it seems like they really are contradicting what the Bible says about God's nature. They believe in falsehoods. The misconceptions that they hold to has led them astray. It's led them into behaviors that are unloving, argumentative, and dishonest, in my opinion. Some people often think of God, the God of the Bible, as the Greek god Zeus. They think of him as if he sits on a cloud and gets mad at people for their failures. God then zaps them and makes bad things happen in their lives. These are punishments for people's bad behaviors, failures, or for making the gods angry, so to speak. Many people think of God as being so wrathful against sin that they can't comprehend his love. This also leads to big misunderstandings about God's forgiveness, grace, and mercy. I believe this explains why there's a lot of confusion these days about what God is actually like. These misunderstandings cause people to get confused about current events in the world. They don't understand why God doesn't pour out his wrath to destroy people that they perceive as the evil people in the world. Many people don't understand why God doesn't pour out more of his wrath to destroy more people. They don't understand why God doesn't wipe out people who start wars. They don't understand why he doesn't depose governments that are involved in terrible things. They don't understand why God hasn't wiped out people with different moral standards. It just plain baffles them. This shows that many people don't understand that love is the nature of God, and that's his core essence. Some people believe God is both a loving and a wrathful God at the same time. Thus, they make it seem like God is either bipolar or like he's a raging alcoholic. They can't tell if he's going to be kind or be like a raging alcoholic father that comes home and beats his wife and children. Now, I don't believe God is a raging alcoholic, nor do I believe he's bipolar or psychologically unstable. I believe God helps us have a peaceful and sound mind. You can see that in Isaiah 26:3, Philippians 4:7, John 14:27, John 16:33, Galatians 5:22, and Colossians 3:15. The assumption that God's holiness automatically means he's mad at us is unfounded as well. God's holiness is actually a reference to his otherworldliness. His otherworldliness refers to the difference between him and humans, such as God is spirit, and we have a fragile flesh. We humans are bound by space and time, while we are in this flesh anyway. Yet God isn't limited by space and time. So God's holiness doesn't guarantee that God is angry with us or wants to wipe us out. God can only and always be loving and good to us. Any other ideas contrary to God's love and goodness is a distortion and isn't the truth. I also believe that God's love and holiness are meshed together and are inseparable. If you want to see what it's like when God's holiness and love are meshed together, you might want to read 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8, and Galatians 5, 22-23. Those show God's love and his character. You might also notice that there isn't anything there about anger and wrath. Some of the things I'm going to say here in a second are about things theologians say, and are things I say kind of tongue-in-cheek and with a little bit of a laugh. So I say it with a bit of a laugh, and I don't intend any disrespect or harsh words to anyone. I'm going to show what typical Christian theologians mean when they use the term cult or cultist. Now, I try not to use those terms because it puts people off and puts an end to any potential for meaningful conversations with other people. I can also say that I'm no heresy hunter like some people who go around seemingly calling everyone a cultist. Now, several years ago, I'm not so proud to say I was that kind of a person. I knew a lot of theology, and I knew how to point things out to show that people weren't following my version of correct theology. Yet now I realize that those types of conversations only cause people to be afraid to talk to me. Some people even pointed out that I was only talking down to people and being very unkind. Yikes, that wasn't good. So let me tell you what typical Christian theologians would say and why they say these types of things. Many theologians say that if you add or take away aspects of God's nature, you have departed from the faith. This can be seen in the book Confronting the Cults by Gordon Lewis, copyright 1975, page 4. Theologians will say that this means you are outside of acceptable Christian teaching or outside the pale of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy means good, right, or straight teaching. They say this because they consider that you have gone astray from primary doctrines of the Bible. So these theologians would say that you have stepped outside of Christianity and into the doctrine of the cults. They will add that if you throw out the main primary theme of the Bible, you have stepped outside of Christianity. So if someone says God doesn't have the nature of love, theologians would say that they have discarded a primary doctrine, the doctrine of God's nature. That primary doctrine is the nature of God and his core essence. So theologians would say that those people are believing in the doctrine of cults, by their own definition of what cults would be. A good example of discarding primary doctrine is Christians who say God's love must have balance. They will say God's love is balanced by his justice and wrath against sin. Yet the Bible never shows justice and wrath to be part of God's nature. So they will have added an aspect to God's nature, or they'll drag love away from being God's nature so they can be equal. Yet theology dictates that you can't add to or take away from God's nature, or you will engage in heresy, or become a cultist, or engage in believing in doctrines of cults. I say the word cultist kind of tongue-in-cheek, of course, with a bit of a laugh. I don't like to use those types of words and names, but I'm only showing what theologians would say. I'm not saying that God refuses to allow people into heaven because they have an incorrect way of thinking. I believe that God can and will reconcile all things to himself, as it's mentioned in Colossians 1:19 and 20. Yet it seems to me that we all have faulty thinking sometimes. A good way to see my point is by looking at 1 Corinthians 13:5. In this verse, it states that God doesn't hold grudges, or God doesn't keep a record of our wrongs, depending on which version you read. So God will not hold anything against us. I see no clear evidence anywhere in the Bible that shows holding incorrect ideas ensures we will never go to heaven. Although it might dull the kingdom within, that's what I think it is, so it seems that God will definitely reconcile all things to himself. Even the apostles got caught up with incorrect ideas at times. They believed non-Israeli believers should follow their old religious rules and rituals. Yet the Apostle Paul confronted the other apostles on this issue and showed them evidence to the contrary. Paul showed that some non-Israeli believers had the power of the Holy Spirit working in them without following their religious rules or customs. So we can all have flaws in our thinking, even if we try to follow God and his love sometimes. So, since many Christians think God is an angry God and not loving, they follow, in a way, I guess their own theologians would call it a heresy. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek and with a slight chuckle. I don't mean to call anyone names or make derogatory comments. I only say it because they have added or subtracted parts of God's nature, so they would fall into the same theological trap. They fit their own definitions of what Christian theologians would call a heresy. They reject a primary doctrine about God's nature. Some of us consider it impolite to call someone a derogatory name such as cultist or heretic. So perhaps we should drop the names and the words and say that they're outside the pale of orthodoxy or outside of typical accepted teachings. Now, if we look beyond the names and the arguments, I think changes are definitely needed in the church these days. I'd say that fundamentalist and evangelical Christians might want to at least examine their beliefs. They might also want to realize that according to their own beliefs, a person could say they're cultists. According to their own beliefs and theology, they fit their own definition of a cultist. Oops. I mean they're outside the pale of orthodoxy, of primary teaching of their own belief system. So they might consider that they could have at least made some mistakes in their beliefs or made some bad assumptions. This shows why phrases about God's love have become mere cliches these days. It's why it seems powerless and meaningless to many Christians. Despite all the talk about God's love, it's rarely seen because of the reasons I just mentioned. Now, I have empathy and sympathy for people who doubt God's love. I know how they think because I used to be like them. I went to similar church groups and learned similar things myself. They are like this because they haven't had a life-changing experience with God's love. They may not even notice their own harsh attitudes. It could even be that they only sense it on a subconscious or unconscious level. They might be quick to deny it in strong terms, but to most other people around them, it's obvious. Yet I'm convinced better things of God's love, and that God's love can change anyone. I know because I used to be that guy. And oh, what a change it made in me. Now, I'd like to talk about something a bit different right now, and let you folks know about something before I end the show. I've been working on a book about my life and how I first learned about God's love, and I just finished the book. I got through all the deep dives into editing the book, and I finally finished it. The book is titled Journal to a Journey, and the subtitle is My Life is More Than Wishes and Dreams. Here's a short video presentation of the book. See what you think. What would you do if you had a dream where a glowing person told you to leave the church you attended? What if you then ended up learning about God's unconditional love and it forever changed your life? Learn about these and other miraculous events that guided one man's life. Read the new book, Journal to a Journey, coming soon on Amazon. The whole book is about the miraculous events that led me to learn about God's love. I also show a lot of the circumstances that led me to that point in my life. I even show more miraculous events that led me through the next few years after I learned about God's love. I can tell you with all certainty that God has guided me all the way. I remember that Paul Gray said he told people to ask God to show them whether they are loved, then simply see what happens in their life to see if God reveals His love to them. I can tell you that God can reveal His love to you. So remember, God loves you with an unconditional love. Remember this little quote from a guy I saw on the internet one time. His name is Mick Mooney. He says this: "A heart full of love reaches into places where a head full of doctrines never will." That's something we all need to remember. I'm trying a new experiment with the show today. I've got a QR code you can scan if you'd like to support the show. If you scan the QR code, it should bring you to a website so you can make a donation to my PayPal account. I thought that might make it easy for folks to support this show. As for now, I'm Lenny Manning, your host of the Agape Guy Show. I hope to see you in the next episode. Have a great day. I hope to see you later.